So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third talk in the Technology and Society Coloquium series, sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Center of Excellence in Enterprise Technology, or CEET for short. The center was founded in 2004 to explore scalability aspects in enterprise-level domains, including the corporate, the scientific, and the education sectors. CEET fosters cross-disciplinary collaboration between Villanova experts, external academic researchers, and industry partnerships all over the world. Its members conduct research in cybersecurity, education, healthcare systems, machine learning applications, and virtual reality. Since its founding, the center's members have led sponsored research projects with over $15 million in competitive funding from a wide range of organizations, including the National Science Foundation, NASA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, and Comcast. Essential societal needs such as healthcare, social services, food security, education, defense, and others are facing scaling problems from population growth and economic costs like never before. Even political processes such as voting, free expression, and news dissemination are feeling pressure to adapt. One common solution has been to simply develop technology and software to manage these needs more efficiently and equitably. These solutions, however, are not magic. They invariably come with costs and limitations, and it is essential for members of society to understand these factors before adopting that technology wholesale. CEET, therefore, has established this Technology and Society Coloquium series to help the Villanova community learn how computational approaches to addressing societal needs are being designed and how those designs can impact society. Our series' educational goal is to enable participants to evaluate these approaches' strengths and weaknesses as they are scaled to society's needs, thereby fostering informed decision-making for today's users of technology at the personal, community, national, and global levels. Our colloquium speaker today is Dr. Venkat Margapuri. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Computing Sciences at Villanova University and a research faculty member of the Center of Excellence in Enterprise Technology. He earned a PhD in computer science at Kansas State University. He works in the intersection of cyber-physical systems and artificial intelligence. Dr. Margapuri has published in leading venues such as IEEE, Elsevier, and BMVA, the British Machine Vision Association. His current research centers on smart agriculture and self-evolving large language models, which coincidentally figures in today's talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Margapuri.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Klasner, for the introduction, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here at this time of day. I know this is perhaps late in the day, and I know this is some point in time when you might be looking at going home, but thank you so much for being here. I'll try and make sure your stay is worth the while. So, moving on to the talk for today. I know the title of the talk is sort of skeptical, and that was something that I had on purpose. So the title of Do Large Language Models Really Reason? With really in quotes. So the question that I'm really trying to perhaps answer and perhaps help everybody understand is, when ChatGPT or perhaps Gemini or perhaps a different large language model explains something step by step, right? Does it really mean it is thinking behind the scenes? And if it is, what is its thought process? So that is basically what we are trying to, or what I am trying to address as this talk progresses. So I'll start out with the core mechanism behind any large language model's thought process, if you will. So large language models, unlike humans, do not possess a brain, right? And this is something that I'm sure everybody knows. But the core mechanism, the idea behind a large language model working the way it does is large language models essentially focus on predicting the next token. Now the question becomes, what is a token? Is this something that we get at an arcade? Definitely not. And if it were, I'm sure large language models would be a lot more fun and perhaps a lot more broke as well. But either way, tokens do not mean the same tokens that we get at an arcade. So here's what a token means. So a token is the smallest unit of text that a large language model can process and understand. Now there can be different types of tokens. So common token ideas are a full word token, where an entire word that we typically understand is a token. And then tokens can also be subwords. Say, let's say you have the word playing. Now play, the word play could be a token, and the word ink, which is typically not something that means something to us, could also be a token. Now you might say, this doesn't make sense. How can the word ing be a real token that is processed by a large language model? So here's the deal. So these large language models, as and when they are trained, as and when they're trying to learn ideas, what happens behind the scenes is it's impossible or practically not possible for humans to show them every word in the dictionary. Sure, they can, but it's just a lot of resources and compute that's involved. So by essentially enabling subword tokens, what happens is, let's say the large language model is trained on a word called doing and the word play. Okay? By essentially enabling these subword tokens, the large language model is able to piece play and ing together and put together the word playing and understand what playing means as well, in addition to the word doing that it was originally trained on. So this way, we are essentially, the large language models are essentially able to infer from words or vocabulary that they have not been trained on, essentially saving us a lot of compute. So that is the reason behind also, large language models also allowing or facilitating subword tokens. Likewise, other tokens could be regular symbols such as the period, comma, question mark, or perhaps even white spaces. So since we have a lot of people in the room, in case you are interested in how OpenAI tokenizes text, okay? OpenAI offers a demo tool at this link, which is platform.openai.tokenizer. So if you hop onto this link, OpenAI will talk about different tokenizers present in different models of theirs. It offers you, the text that you see on the screen that says many words map to one token, but some don't, indivisible, and so on and so forth, that is present in the box, essentially has 252 characters, but only amounts to 53 different tokens. So 53 tokens is what this large language models processes behind the scenes, not 252 characters. Sure, all 252 of the characters are getting processed, but in the eyes of the large language model, they're essentially 53 different tokens. And this is GPT-4o and GPT-4o Mini's tokenization. As you can see up there, up above the box, you can, OpenAI also allows you to look at tokens present in GPT 3.5 and other legacy models as well. And this is a screenshot I captured about a month and a half ago, right at the time when GPT-5 was being launched. So maybe in a few days, they will also allow us to visualize the tokenization inside of GPT-5 as well. So now the question becomes, okay, large language models are able to process these tokens, and I just mentioned that large language models function by predicting tokens. Now, how exactly does this prediction happen? What's the rationale? What's the reasoning, or what's the thought process behind these large language models predicting these tokens? So before I talk about what tokenization is, or not tokenization, but before I talk about how these large language models produce these tokens or predict these tokens, since we have a very enthusiastic audience here in the room, let us play a couple of guessing game activities, right? So please observe the first one that says Mac and fill in the blank. Okay, what's the first answer that comes to mind?
Cheese.
Cheese. Okay. Any others apart from cheese?
PC.
PC. Okay.
Maybe book, like book.
Book. Okay. Any others? All right. So let's just take these three answers for instance. So we got cheese, we got PC, we got book. So a lot of you said cheese. A few of you perhaps thought PC, and I think there was only one person who said book. Okay. Now, how much of this is also contextual? So what I mean by that is, see, I'm originally from India, okay? And I know we have a couple of other students from India as well, so please keep me honest here. But a lot of people in India have no idea what macaroni is, right? So if you say Mac in India, right, they probably, 99% of the time, the answer won't be cheese, okay? Just because we're sitting in an American classroom, the answer, perhaps the obvious answer is cheese, but growing up, I never had any idea what macaroni was, until I moved to the US, right? So, models, 2 points here. First thing is these large language models are trained on different kinds of information from different sources, okay? And their prediction is essentially probability based, okay? So just like you all predicted cheese, right? So perhaps 9 out of 10 thought cheese as their first choice. So likewise, these large language models also say, okay, as I was trained on, say, Mac and fill in the blank, 9 times out of 10, I saw the word cheese appear. And then perhaps once or twice, I saw the word PC appear, or then perhaps the word book appear, and so on and so forth. So large language models, as they predict something, if you ask them a question, they're basically asking themselves the question of, what have I seen as I was trained? Okay, I've seen cheese appear the most, so that will be the first response that I put out as and when a user asks me a question, right? Now, this is also one of the reasons why people sometimes feel large language models are biased, okay? Now, where does this bias come from? This bias comes from the data that these large language models are trained. And again, I understand the word bias essentially has a negative connotation to it, but it doesn't always have to be all that negative. Even the inclination towards cheese, when the question is Mac and fill in the blank, is biased, right? Because why should the model even predict cheese when there could be a whole bunch of other options that could be considered, right? So it's not all that negative, but even minor inclinations can be considered bias. So let's do the second one, which is perhaps a lot more neutral. So what would you fill in the blank when the question is, I need a charger for my phone?
Snowblower.
Snowblower, okay, all right, good answer.
Battery.
Right, so these are all great answers, but perhaps the most common answer would be electric vehicle, right? And this is something that I looked up before I got here, so it's not that I'm making this up, all right? So, long story short, a large language model does not pick the right answer. So if an LLM says something to you, it does not mean that is the correct answer. It just samples from a bunch of probabilities that it acquired as it was trained on data. So that's the point. So what large language models do not have are goals, truth detectors, and self-awareness. Okay? So as much as people think that the large language model, LLMs typically tend to drive you in a certain direction, they don't have an inherent sense of goal-driven behavior to drive you in a certain direction. They drive you because, they appear to drive you because of the data that they were once trained on. Okay, so it's just data behind the scenes that essentially drives a large language model behavior, but the model itself does not have any specific goals or agenda. Right? Now you might say, but they sound intelligent. When I ask them a question, they talk to me in a super intelligent manner that makes me think they actually are thinking or reasoning behind the scenes. And again, this goes back to data once again. I know I've been talking about data multiple times, but this is a point that is perhaps the crux of my talk as well. I want people to, perhaps everybody to understand that data is what's driving these models behind the scenes. The models are not driving themselves. So where have these models been trained off of? So data has been collected from different websites, perhaps almost all of the websites that you have on the internet, Wikipedia, different books such as textbooks, and because we have a lot of computer scientists in the room, a lot of code has also been used to train these large language models, primarily sourced from GitHub, right? So now the key idea is large language models have understood or learned to model how reasoning is written, but that doesn't always mean that they verify their reasoning. So what I mean by that is they've been trained on all of this data, they've been trained on all of this text, so they essentially understand what well-reasoned data looks like, what well-reasoned text looks like. But when they generate this well-reasoned looking text, it's not that they've always verified the information. It is possible that they have not verified. 9 times out of 10, they probably have not verified, which is one of the reasons why we encounter hallucinations, but that's something that we'll get to in a minute. But the key point is, large language models have mastered the art of generating well-reasoned look-alike text, but it's not always well-reasoned. So to perhaps drive this idea further, I have gone ahead and performed a few interactions with ChatGPT. Okay, and again, I say ChatGPT loosely here because this is something that is akin to large language models in general, nothing specific to ChatGPT, right? So the interactions that I'm about to show you will essentially help you understand some of the implicit reasoning that is inherent within large language model generated responses. So the question that you see on the slide says, should a college student work a part-time job during the semester? It's not a complex question. If I ask each one of you would have an answer right away, straight up, right? So, sure, opinions might differ, but then each of us will be able to come up with an answer. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I've gone ahead and sort of consolidated the response that ChatGPT gave me, because if you think about it, if you go onto ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT this question, it will put out an answer that is 2 pages long, even for a simple question such as this, right? So for perhaps presentation purposes, I've gone ahead and consolidated that information without losing perhaps the original intent of ChatGPT. So ChatGPT said something to the effect of, working a part-time job during the semester can offer financial benefits and help students develop time management skills. So if you think about it, it talks about the positive upfront. Okay, that's followed by, however, it may also introduce stress and reduce time available for academics, so students should consider their workload, academic goals, and personal circumstances before deciding. So that sort of talked about the cons or the pitfalls or the downsides to working a job during the semester. So I started out with a pro, followed that by a pitfall. So moving on to some of the key observations. If you think about the question said, should a student work a part-time job during the semester? Right? It's a simple yes or no question. But did it give us a yes or no answer? No, not in this case, not in any case. So you go into ChatGPT and ask it any question, it never gives you a straight up answer. It always sounds diplomatic. Now, is this a flaw? Is this a bug? It is not. It is by design. Because if you think about these large language models, there's a lot of big tech corporations that make this, and they know that sometimes people can just take large language model advice at face value, and it might have detrimental effects. So large language models are usually modeled to be diplomatic. So when you think about, perhaps when you experience a large language model being diplomatic and with you, I mean it's not an inherent flaw. It's just the way they're designed. And if you think about the response that it gave me a simple conclusion-looking response, but the reasoning itself was implicit. So in other words, you have to perhaps go through the answer in a lot more detail to understand what its thought process might have been, right? Because it hasn't laid out its thought process for one. And if you wish to perhaps understand its thought process, you would have to perhaps dissect the response in detail, in a lot more depth, to understand or perhaps predict what its thought process might have been. Now, you can essentially make a slight change or a tweak to your prompt in order to make sure the large language model lays out its thought process, so to speak, along with the response that is generated. So a simple tweak that you might make is adding this one-liner that says, think step by step before answering, and follow that with the original question, which is, should a college student work a part-time job during the semester? So the question itself has not changed. I've only added an extra sentence to the question. Now the model has put out an answer that looks like this. It starts by saying, let's think step by step. That's followed by benefits as a bullet point, followed by costs as another bullet point, followed by conclusion as a bullet point. Now in this case, the answer is a lot more elaborate, for one, and it has clearly listed the benefits, costs, and conclusion, essentially helping us understand that its thought process, or perhaps at least helping us perhaps get an idea of its thought process, that it was basically evaluating the benefits and costs as it answered this question. Okay. Now we'll dive into this answer in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But this thought process, or perhaps this idea of having a large language model put out its own thought process, is referred to as chain of thought. So chain of thought is the idea wherein you force a large language model to produce intermediate reasoning as text. So with chain of thought, you're essentially forcing a large language model to explain itself as it answers a particular question. Now, here's the key point. Chain of thought is an output format. It is not a formal proof. Okay? So chain of thought is an output format, just like JSON, just like, another tabular format, but it is not a formal proof that the model has verified its own answer. Okay? The answer might sound like it is more well thought out, but it is not guaranteed. So now let's just observe this model response in a little bit more detail. Okay? So let's focus a little bit more on the costs. If you observe the step, perhaps the response within the cost section, it says, studies show that part-time jobs can reduce study time and sleep, increasing stress and potentially hurting grades, especially with long hours or inflexible schedules. Okay? Sounds well thought out, but has it cited any studies? Who knows if there are even studies to this effect? It says there are studies, but it hasn't given me any citations, right? So sure, it might sound a lot more well thought out, but there's no guarantee that it is saying the truth or even that it has verified its own responses. So my take on this is, anytime you see a thoughtful looking response put out by a large language model, the right question to ask is, what assumptions are being made behind the scenes, rather than asking, is this answer logical sounding? Right? So in order to perhaps understand the assumptions that a large language model makes, we'll look at a couple of different strategies next. But now, let's understand why chain of thought is even, I don't know how many of you have heard about chain of thought prior to this talk of mine, but chain of thought is something that is like prevalent. So if you open up like any kind of AI literature, they talk about chain of thought. Now, you might say, what is the point of chain of thought when I just said, even with chain of thought, there's no guarantee that large language model responses are, perhaps verified. So the argument for this is, let's just think about what happened when I made the model put out its thought process. It generated more text. Okay. So what happens behind the scenes is, large language models do not have a scratch pad to perhaps do scratch work on as they generate their answers. So their scratch work is essentially context. So what I mean by context is, by essentially making this model generate more text. Okay, so just think about what more text means. More text means the model has generated more tokens. So every token the model generates acts as contextual information for the next token. So behind the scenes, what happens is the model has essentially invested more computational power in generating this answer when I made it lay out its thought process. And because the model was investing more computational power and generating more tokens, where each token acted as perhaps the context for the subsequent token, the argument is that we've essentially provided large language models with working memory. Okay, so this is perhaps the closest that large language models have come to having working memory, and this is one of the reasons why, or perhaps the key reason why, chain of thought is essentially like marketed as something that is pretty good. Right? So now, let's talk a little bit about how to reason alongside LLMs. Right? So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, or perhaps a couple of slides ago, there is a way, large language models appear to like lay out their thought processes, but they don't always do. But we as well-informed users, can essentially try and understand their thought process in detail using assumption forcing prompts and performing counterfactual testing. So here's what I mean by assumption forcing prompts. So let's say we want to ask the large language model the same question of, should a student or perhaps a college student work a part-time job during the semester? So instead of asking this question directly, right, before writing this prompt out, write another simple prompt that is a precursor to this that says something to the effect of, before answering, list the assumptions you are making. Okay, and then ask your question as before. Now, what happens when you do this is the large language model lays out its own assumptions. Now, what are these assumptions? These are assumptions that the large language model has developed over time from the data it has seen before as it was trained on. So, these assumptions are essentially a resemblance, or basically give us an idea of what kind of information, what kind of data this large language model was trained on. Okay. Now, when you look at these assumptions, look at these. These are the top 4 assumptions that I got back from ChatGPT. It says student controls work hours, job is flexible, student is academically stable, and health and sleep are not compromised. So ChatGPT is assuming that all 4 of these ideas are true as it answered my question. Now, it is possible for me, for my personal scenario, to be slightly different. maybe I don't control the number of hours I work. Maybe my job is not flexible. Maybe my health and sleep are being compromised, right? So now that we understand the large language model's frame of reference, now the subsequent prompt I can give is answer assuming a key condition changes. In other words, I can say, assume the student must work for 25 hours a week instead of, say, just 10 to 15 hours. Now, the subsequent response that I got back was once again like 1 or 2 pages long, but it was to the effect of, perhaps not. The student should not be performing or perhaps working during the semester. So the idea is, because I changed the assumption that was provided to ChatGPT or the large language model, the large language model was able to adapt its response, right? But it is important for us to understand the large language model's frame of reference, because its frame of reference is the data it has seen before in the past. And that particular data might not align with our personal situations or conditions. So that's the key point to remember. So moving on, so prompting. So prompting essentially is basically what large language models, or perhaps we as users of large language models essentially rely on to interact with these models. So prompting in a way is behavior selection. Because large language models have been trained on information from different sources, they essentially know how a person in a particular profession or a walk of life behaves. So they have that piece of context, and because we have a lot of students here in the room as well, a great use case of perhaps large language models is to understand concepts and subjects and topics that you're not familiar with. Like, I'll give you a personal example of mine. Growing up, I was never great at math, right? Sure, I was good enough to do well, but then I'm not the greatest at math. But in the past few years, so I will also say this, I've always had a keen interest in math. It's just that I never really had the aptitude for it, for top level math. But ever since these large language models came out, one of my hobbies is to just go onto ChatGPT and understand topics in detail, right? Understand some of these ideas in detail that I might not be able to understand from just reading a textbook. And that has had a profound impact on the way I conduct my research, or perhaps just go about my math in general. And this might be true for everybody, right? So everybody has a certain area where they might want to improve. Everybody has an area where they're interested in, but might not have access to information. So ChatGPT or large language models are essentially great at providing such context and such information. So if you observe the content on the slide, here's where I asked ChatGPT a simple question: what is photosynthesis? I'm sure a lot of us, perhaps all of us in this room, know the answer to it, but I asked ChatGPT in 2 different ways. The first one is I asked it to explain it like it were explaining to a 10-year-old, and please observe the answer. It basically gives me a 1-line answer that says, photosynthesis is how plants make their own food, and they use sunlight, water, and air to make sugar so they can grow. Pretty generic, an answer that a 10-year-old might be able to understand. Now, I asked the same question, but instead, this time I asked it to explain it to a biology major. So this time, the answer is, definitely looks like it is at the college level, because it talks about ideas such as chloroplast and chemical energy and Calvin cycle. And these are ideas that I wasn't even familiar with before I asked this question, right? So in addition to prompting, there is one more thing that matters, and that is context. So large language models, sure, they see the prompt, but in addition to prompt, they also rely on contextual information. So context is essentially all the information that the large language model has in addition to the prompt to answer a specific question. And a large language model's context essentially depends on the contextual window capacity of the model. So to give you an example of the contextual window of a particular language, a large language model, and why this is important, please observe the text on the slide. I'm not sure if you're all able to read it. Is this okay? All right. So I start out, so this is a simple conversation I had, and I started out by asking, hello LLM, how are you? It gave me a generic response. And then I asked it, do you know my name? It said, no, I don't know your name, okay, or something to that particular effect. Now moving on to slide number 2, or perhaps section 2, I said, my name is Venkat Margapuri, and it greeted me saying, nice to meet you, Venkat. And then I followed that by asking it, tell me about photosynthesis. Okay, and then that's the answer that I got back on on perhaps section number 3. Okay, now if you observe section number 4, I asked it the question of what is my name once again. So remember, I told it my name a couple of interactions ago, and then when I asked it my name, it said, you did not mention your name. Why? The reason is context window. So context window is basically describes all the information a large language model has to answer a specific question. Now, this model that I used here for this interaction is Villanova 3.1. So this is not a new model. This is not state-of-the-art model, right? So that's why this model doesn't have as big a context window. And I also used a tool called LM Studio. And this might actually come in handy if you want to explore some of these ideas as well. So there's this tool called LM Studio. And this tool lets you tweak different parameters. So it lets you set the size of the context window. It lets you set different other parameters pertinent to large language models and help you explore different behaviors within large language models. So in this case, I set the context window to about 100 or 200 tokens. I don't exactly remember. But because I set the context window to such a small amount, right after it generated this answer for photosynthesis, it basically forgot that I had told its name prior to that. So that's the reason why this did not work as expected. So that brings us to the idea of confabulations. So confabulations is nothing but a coherent but ungrounded explanation. In colloquial terms, confabulations are typically referred to as hallucinations. So hallucinations are basically made up content that hasn't been verified. Right? And typical examples include fake citations, and this is something that we oftentimes battle, especially in academia and research, and misinformation in general. So any kind of misinformation can be attributed to confabulations. And the reason behind confabulations is this. Large language models are trained to generate the next token. They're just token generators. They don't always verify information. And in fact, that's not even something they're trained to do. Which is why when you ask them a question that they have no knowledge about, they still go ahead and put out some kind of information. So now, large language models can assume different roles. And one of the roles they can assume is that of a critic. In other words, you can ask a large language model to do something, and you can also ask it to critique its own self. Now, there's this argument that anytime you ask a large language model to critique itself, it sort of auto-corrects its own responses if it made a mistake when it originally generated the response. But in my experience, I have not found that to be true. Because, and this is my belief. I believe that because even when you ask it to critique itself, it's essentially doing another text generation pass. It's doing another token generation pass, but the same holes in its context or knowledge base exist even while it acts as a critique. So that's my take on this. So now, moving on to how to build trustworthy apps. So far, I know AI hasn't been prevalent for a long time. It's not that AI has been around for 25 years or so, but even in the past 3 or 4 years, there have been a lot of apps built using AI. But recently, perhaps in the last couple of years or so, one of the movements, I mean, that has recently come about is building trustworthy applications using AI. Basically, apps that users can reliably trust instead of worrying about, is this app really being honest with me? So in order to build trustworthy apps, one thing you might be able to do as users is supply the data or provide the model with information, so the model has some kind of information to ground its responses on. And then, in addition to providing the information, you can also add verifiers to verify any of the key constraints you believe are essential for your application to work correctly. And this idea in recent times has become popular, and this is known as retrieval augmented generation, commonly referred to as RAG. So to give you an example of what RAG is. So let's say we ask a simple question that says, according to the US Constitution, how many senators are there? Now, to answer a question as simple as this, you don't really have to provide your own document with information. Why? Because this information is so generic that whoever built these large language models, say OpenAI for ChatGPT or Google for Gemini, they've already trained large language models on this information as to how many senators are there according to the US Constitution. Now, I understand that this model produces responses even without you providing custom information, but just think about where its information is coming from. Its information is coming from OpenAI or Google or whoever developed those models. But let's say you want your own document to be referenced as ChatGPT or perhaps a large language model produces their responses. You can do so, okay? And you can do so, and I was just going to state this example of, your document might have text that is worded slightly differently compared to the text that was provided by, say, the developers of these large language models. And if you want your large language model to behave in accordance with the rules of your application, give it text, even if you believe that the same text or similar text has already been provided by the original developer itself. So that way you can essentially make these large language models behave in a way that you expect of your application. So what RAG does not do is it still does not prove logical correctness. You might still run into reasoning errors, and there is no enforcement of constraints by RAG. Now you might say, you just talked about trustworthy apps and you said RAG is the way to go. Sure, RAG is the way to go, but I haven't talked about all of RAG yet. By providing it with custom information or information that is pertinent to your app, you can essentially guarantee that the information that is being referenced belongs to the information that is being referenced is essentially coming from the documents that you have supplied it. But there can still be errors in math or logic made by the large language model. So to give you a simple example about that, let's say you provide custom information about how many senators are there, right? So, and then you ask a simple question of, if there are 50 states and each state has 2 senators, how many senators are there? So it's pretty simple. It seems like a pretty simple question wherein the answer is 100. Now, the large language model, because you've provided it with information ahead of time, it will reference your document. It will find that each state has 2 senators because that was the text present in your document. But it still has to do the math of 50 times 2 and arrive at the answer of 100, but that's not always guaranteed, right? So it's like the human brain. So there is a section of brain that is responsible for, say, reasoning. There is another section of brain that is responsible for emotional quotient and whatnot, right? So likewise, with RAG, you can guarantee that the information that is being pulled is yours, but then any reasoning about the information is not something we can guarantee. So how do we guarantee that information? So you can guarantee that by adding additional calculators or symbolic solvers or perhaps even rule-based constraints. And this is logic that you can essentially model within your own application using code written by you, right? So you can write this code in C, C#, Java, whatever language have you, and then model these kinds of verifiers. Now, a popular verification technique these days, especially the one that's being used in industry, is model context protocol. In other words, agentic AI. So if you think about what agentic AI is, okay, I'm not saying model context protocol is agentic AI, but it is pretty widely used when it comes to agentic AI. But what happens with agentic AI behind the scenes is, agentic AI has RAG. Okay. In addition to RAG, it also has these different tools behind the scenes to essentially verify the outputs that a large language model generates. So that is essentially what model context protocol is. I mean, we probably don't have enough time to go over model context protocol during this talk, but that might be something to explore for yourselves as you perhaps look into the world of agentic AI itself. Now, as I get to the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about an application, a mobile application that we in our research group have been working on for the past 12 months or so. And I want to demonstrate how we actually enforce trustworthiness within this, or perhaps using this application. So this application is something that classifies 18 different species of solidago. So solidago is the scientific name for this flower called goldenrod. A lot of you might have seen this out in the wild. So because this app was modeled on 18 different species, right? So we had to gather information from different websites. Now, the information that we gathered was belonged to two different modes. First one is the image mode. So we gathered a lot of information from repositories such as iNaturalist and GBIF. And we also gathered a lot of textual information, basically information about each of these different types of flowers, each of these 18 different species of flowers from USDA's website, because they're like the master or perhaps the source of truth for anything ag related. Now, like I said, there are 18 different species that are being modeled by the app, but even on USDA's website, I mean, some of these species are so rare to occur that even on USDA's website, we were only able to identify 14 different species, information for 14 different species. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play this video, perhaps on the next slide, because this has... so it shows full screen. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it at different locations to show you what's happening. But the text in black, right, in black and blue, so that is information about each of these different species. It's not all the information, just enough to understand what's going on. And what you see on the right-hand side is the simulator for the application on a mobile phone. So here's how this app works. So a user is able to go ahead and pick an image of their choice. Oops, excuse me. A user is able to go ahead and pick an image of their choice, and this app basically uses, I'm just going to try and see if I can pause it. Yeah. So this app uses different deep learning models to predict what kind of a flower it is, right? So in this case, its top 3 predictions were solidago, different kinds of species. I don't even want to pronounce their names, but so as you can see, it gave out its top 3 predictions. Now, it gave out its top 3 predictions because even the large language model, or perhaps a deep learning model in this case, is not entirely sure that it is a particular kind of species. And it is a reasonable problem as well. I mean, it's not, so what I'm trying to say is, it's not unreasonable, or perhaps it's not reasonable to expect our deep learning model to be super precise, especially because how close each species is to another, at least in terms of, at least visually. So please observe a top 1 prediction here that says, Misorinesis, I think. So now we have also gone ahead and built a chatbot, basically a chatbot assistant that helps users using this app understand more information about the prediction that was made. So in this case, the user is asking, what is its common name? So when it asks for the common name, or when the user asks for the common name, the chatbot does not respond with any information. It responds with verified information. And where is that information coming from? That's coming from USDA's own website. Okay, so as you can see, the response that gets generated is being identified on the text pad. And as you can see, it says the common name for Solidago, whatever that species is Missouri goldenrod. And as you can see, that is also verified information coming from USDA's website that we have scraped and made a part of our application. So we can guarantee that we are not going to put out incorrect information. Now, let me show you a few other scenarios and questions as well. So we ask about its active growth period, and active growth period is also part of the information that we have captured. So that shows up as expected. And we ask a question about its bloom period, and as you can see, bloom period is present on line 536. So it puts out that information also. Trust guaranteed. So I'm going to pull it slightly forward to demonstrate a negative scenario. All right. So now please observe the question that's about to come out next. We ask it, is it a toxic plant? Now, we don't really have any kind of information about whether this plant is toxic or not. So this model, or perhaps this app that we have developed, now says, maybe it'll say something in a minute. Okay, so as you can see, it says there is no toxicity listed for Missouri goldenrod in the database, right? So all the large language models are inherently developed or inherently text generators. They are developed to predict the next token. You can essentially force these large language models to not do so, or to perhaps act correctly by essentially using these verifiers. So we have the verifiers model. We have Mustafa here, who actually modeled a lot of this application's chatbot. And we have a couple of other developers from the CS department, one of them Ali, and then Garrick and Abby Loyson as well. So that's about how this application functions, and this is something that we're looking to take live in the next foreseeable future. So that is everything I have as part of this talk. Thank you so much for being here, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Venkat. So we have time for, I think, one or two questions. Any questions from the audience here?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll let Venkat do the choosing.
So is that me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a few of them, but I will ask the one I'm more curious about. When you show the toxicity answer, that basically told, okay, the model was able to tell that it didn't know, wasn't in the database. But it seemed you had toxicity in your data here, and the value for it was not.
Right.
Which would imply we don't know, I assume.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
What would happen if I asked something and that key wasn't in the data? Would it be able to tell, or would it do something?
That's a great point. So currently, I don't think it's able to tell the difference between keys that are present versus keys that are present, but that is something that we will model as we continue developing this app.
So would it say, I don't know because,
So here's the thing. So the large language model generates some text, right? So we have a verifier between the large language model and the user. So we, using the verifier, verify that the information that the large language model is putting out is correct before it reaches the user. So obviously no verifier is 100% perfect. If the model generates something that evades our rules, sure, it will reach the user. But the point here is we are making a conscious effort to put out a trustworthy app as opposed to just spitting out whatever the large language model is saying.
so I guess, right.
Mustafa might be able to answer this better since he worked on it.
It wasn't in the video, but in a case that the key doesn't exist, it's just gonna say, I do not have information about this, but perhaps you meant this. So it's about detect that it doesn't have information on that, and based on the wording, it might suggest something similar.
Yeah.
I think that's reasonable because, yeah, you don't have information, so it's a reasonable thing to say.
Yeah. And again, we're not 100% perfect, trying to get there.
So I have a question to follow up on that one. Would you say that the strength of the large language model in the app that you're describing, is that strength, is it providing information, or is it parsing natural language queries? Where is the strength, do you say, that it's providing in the application you just described?
So large language models have the potential, or perhaps they can provide you with information.
Yeah.
But in this case, we are not relying on whatever the large language model knows as its source of information. In other words, I don't know which model we exactly used. I think we used OpenAI's models in this case. So OpenAI's models are trained by OpenAI. So they've probably provided their models with some kind of information. So as they were trained, they developed two things. One is knowledge, two is text generation ability. With this app, we are trying to make sure we invoke the text generation ability, but not use OpenAI's training data, but instead use our training data. Because we don't know if OpenAI trained these models on information for Solidago. They probably have not, or maybe they have. But whether they have or have not, we don't want OpenAI's training data. We want our training data to be used, but OpenAI's capability will be used as far as text generation ability is concerned.
So when like AI's like when you say that it's like predicting like using like the tokens, I know that we gave that example with like mac and cheese, but like if I answer like a question and there's no like fill in the blank, like what's the prediction?
That's when confabulations occur, because they're just meant to generate the next token. So it again goes down to probability distribution. Sure, it hasn't seen a word, but there's probably some word that even has like a minute probability, right? Which basically shows up at that point. Yes, sir.
I don't know how much you've seen this, but occasionally when I'm using like ChatGPT or something like this, like it'll be spitting out the like long list of things, but abruptly stop like 3/4 of the way through. Is that it? Just like, so I have a few ideas. Is it just like I'm too cheap to get the next version of it, or is it more like, oh, I've spit out this word, I don't think there's anything left?
So I don't think that's the case with the commercial ChatGPT models that we use, but it might be the case that you've run out of like the free tier, and that the model wants you to upgrade at that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I noticed when that happens, I can click continue,
Yeah.
and it just keeps going.
Okay.
So like to me, like I'm doing a little NLP research, but to me when I first thought about it, I was thinking it was thinking that it like said its last word, but it obviously didn't. So I just see that more often than I thought it would. So
Yeah, so I've seen that behavior on the free version. I mean, I also have like a paid subscription for ChatGPT that I use from time to time. I've never seen that happen on that one, but what does happen is when the chat gets super long, regardless of whether whether you're in the free version or the paid subscription, the chat gets pretty slow. So it just doesn't move any further. Yeah.
okay, that also makes sense.
So when you say verifier, like what, is that like looking for keywords or
what does it look like?
Right, so verifiers can be of different types. One of the most recent advancements in terms of verifiers are neuro-symbolic verifiers. I mean, perhaps the most basic version of verifiers could be just symbolic rules you write. So you can just say, is this math right? I mean, you can have something to that effect. But if you're looking for state of the art, it's definitely neuro-symbolic verifiers as far as I'm aware. Yeah. So neuro-symbolic verifiers, just for context, are basically a combination of neural network models and symbolic logic. So symbolic logic is typically what we would see as like the baseline for verifiers. So coupling that with a neural network model essentially provides you with much better verifications, standards. Okay.
I see we're at 5:30, a little bit after, so maybe at this point we should continue our talk over some very delicious food today. And thank you again, Dr. Margapuri.
Thank you so much.